Thanks, Carolyn. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, rao rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I want to start tonight by talking about, because there was some billing earlier on, and I did an opinion piece about 2 months ago, about ending our dependency on oil and gas. This is not working? It is, okay. Yeah, it is, okay, fine. Anyway, ending our dependency on fossil fuels. And so for that purpose, I want to take as my subtext, subtitle, which may be a bit of follow the shift, drilling into New Zealand petroleum industry's predatory delay campaign. I'll deal with how I got there. You may be aware, some of you, that, perhaps all of you, that a month ago, over 11,000 of the world's leading climate scientists designed, this may be whistling very shortly. There it goes. You might want to turn it down just slightly. Thanks.
It's not making much difference anyway.
Sorry for those of you who have implants.
You'll just have to speak loud here.
About a month ago, some 11,000 of the world's leading, mostly climate scientists, issued a declaration, a manifesto, that the world is experiencing a climate emergency, and that the world's population is increasingly in danger of major disaster if there aren't significant, urgent transformations in the global economy and global society. Shortly afterwards, this wasn't widely publicized, the Stockholm Environment Institute, which some of you may know well about, I'll come back to it in a minute, issued a report that the world's governments, including ours, plan to produce a little over 120% more coal, oil, and gas by 2030 than the planet can burn and still stay under 2 degrees. And I think we all ask why the inertia of government action. Well, I want to start by talking a little bit about power and influence. And I'd like to, for that purpose, start by reading a little excerpt from my latest book, Predatory Delay Diaries, most of which are actually diaries from the industry itself. But I also add a lot of editorial and research evidence to pad it in, to put it in context, if you will. And at the beginning, I state, part of the answer to inertia lies in the way that big oil wields its huge financial and political influence over government policymaking and public opinion. A couple of anthropologists, of which I'm one, not these two are different, Benson and Kirsch, in their study of extractive industries, expose some of the strategies that mining and petroleum companies have employed to defend themselves from criticism and threat. And here I quote them, and how this facilitates the perpetuation of harm upon which their production and profits are predicated. Now that's interesting. It's not that their production and profits have an unfortunate circumstance. These anthropologists say in their studies, the business model of the harm industries like petroleum are predicated upon the ability to create and dodge harm. Their business models depend on being able, in other words, to externalize most of the costs of their operations, in effect dumping them onto the climate, on local ecosystems, and onto communities. They simply don't affect the community's bottom line. They are somebody else's problem. These industries profit from human suffering and environmental damage. What political economists call harm industries include tobacco, they include the chemical industry, and closer to home, they even include aluminum smelters, speaking of dumping on communities. They cannot exist without dodging these sorts of externalities, despite making widely publicized claims about the social benefits of their activities, their commitment to abide by legal regulations, their willingness to collaborate with governments and NGOs, and their responsibility as corporate citizens. Well, so let's talk a little bit more about power. Meteorologist Eric Holthaus, in his book, The Future Earth, some of you may be aware of it, calls himself a futurist meteorologist, warns that overcoming a coordinated effort by the fossil fuel industry to save itself is not going to be easy. We know it's happening, and it won't just go away in 2 or 3 more decades. Continuing to quote him, "We'll continue to have a world where people's survival is systematically compromised by the rich and the powerful until the rest of us wake up and realize the power we had all along to fight for a just society." I'll come back to that in the end. So what does all this mean? Well, for one thing, it means that raising awareness about the worsening climate crisis by itself is no longer enough. According to the latest Ipsos poll, a significant percentage, anybody read the results of the latest Ipsos poll about 3 months ago? 80% of New Zealanders report that climate change is very important to them personally. Not just an issue, it's important to them personally. That's double what it was 3 or 4 years ago, all right? That's what they say. Now, social scientists know that what people say and what they do are sometimes very different. And the trick is that politicians know the same thing, which is one reason, at least, that we haven't seen a lot of really bold moves in the last 3 or 4 years, besides the ban on exploration offshore, to address climate change. So, disseminating the latest shocking climate study, putting solar energy on your roof, marching in the streets and demanding that government does something, on their own, they're certainly not enough. The struggle for hearts and minds has shifted to post-COVID recovery planning and whether the next government will adopt policies to accelerate the transformation of our energy system and our economy because of what we know about climate change. My point is that climate-concerned citizens need to understand how power structures operate, how influence is wielded, who's wielding it, how policies are shaped, and how powerful interest groups like big oil can be countered. That is, if we're really serious about ending our dependency on oil and gas in time to make a difference. That's what my recent research has been all about, understanding and exposing the fossil fuel industry's survival campaign and suggesting ways that people and policymakers can respond. I'm an economic anthropologist, and I specialize, as Carolyn has said, in political economy of oil and gas. So in my earlier 2017 study, I attempted to identify the organization, the networks, the lobbying, the key people, key players, the PR gimmicks that the New Zealand petroleum industry has used to promote and defend itself from certainly its environmental critics, but also from potentially harmful government policies that might be coming down the pipeline. I managed to identify at least 7 key strategies, or more accurately, what anthropologist Pierre Bourdieu mentioned several decades ago as, he called it, standard maneuvers. I kind of like that, because if we think strategies of corporations, we think, can't say smoke-filled rooms anymore, but gatherings of particularly males around tables, plotting and planning what's our next strategy going to be to get the greenies, or subvert Greenpeace's attempt to protest our ship. Well, Bourdieu's point was simply that often some executive or team will simply stumble across something which, at least in the media or in lobbying some government minister, seemed to work pretty well. And so the message passes around among the networks, hey, let's use this strategy. Let's use this maneuver. It seemed to work pretty well. I identified 7 of those. But anyway, tonight, I'm not going to go through all 7 tonight. Tonight, I want to focus on just one of those, in which I focused on the strategy of predatory delay campaigning, propaganda, to maintain the industry's social license and slow New Zealand's transition to a low carbon economy. And I want to say that specifically. This campaign is designed not just for public relations purposes, it is specifically designed to slow our transition off of fossil fuels. And I want to also say just a word about how that's influenced government energy and resource policies. So what do I mean by predatory delay? This is where we get a little academic. Predatory delay is defined as the deliberate slowing of change to prolong a profitable but ultimately unsustainable status quo whose costs will be paid by others. Environmental futurist Alex Steffen, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, maintains that for delay to be truly predatory, those engaged in it need to know 2 things. One is that they're hurting others, and the second is that there are other options. And I would argue that that's what makes the practice immoral. Energy journalist Malcolm Harris, I think he writes for the New Yorker, among other things, summed it up pretty well after, this is really ironic, after he was invited to participate in a think tank organized by Shell in London about the future of energy and climate change. And he came away from that, and he had carte blanche. He was told, if I'm coming, he bargained with them, if I'm coming as a journalist, I'm going to report on what I hear. Well, here's his summary when he came away. Petroleum companies aren't planning for a future without oil and gas, at least not anytime soon. But they want the public to think of them as part of the climate solution. Have you heard any of petroleum in New Zealand? We're part of the solution. Before, I'm telling you from the 2017 research I did, I can document about the time, about 7-8 years ago, when PEPANS, the Petroleum Exploration and Production Association of New Zealand, shifted its strategy from resistance and poo-pooing climate change to we're part of the solution. Trust us. Gas will get us there, okay? Well, this is what Malcolm Harris said. We're part of the problem, or part of the solution. In reality, he says, I like this, in reality, they're a problem trying to avoid being solved. Now remember, this is not the normal kind of propaganda campaign, or let's be kind, a PR campaign, that trade associations from chocolate groups to engineering associated, whatever, carry out all the time. Like big tobacco, fossil fuel companies have known for decades, because of their own scientists' work, about the harm their operations and their products are doing, okay? Don't let these companies separate between our products and the way we safely operate and what people do with the stuff. That's not our responsibility. We'll tell that to the tobacco companies who've been taken to the courts. At any rate, so like big tobacco, they've known for decades that their operations are causing harm to the climate and to people. I discussed some of the research about the harm they're doing in my previous book. This campaign that I'm talking about is about survival and about questioning and getting people to question themselves, to question and or ignore the climate science. I had two primary reasons for doing this study, and I had to confess this because several people have talked to me and said, you know, this research, and they've all focused, a couple of journalists have focused on the content of my research. But somebody perceptive enough said, but come on, why did you really do this research? So I had to admit, yeah, I had a couple of motives. The first was that I hoped my investigation might suggest some tools and techniques which concern citizens, of whom I presume most of you, to expose big oil's predatory delay campaign. A little bit like I should catch up with my slides. That citizens might use to expose big oil's predatory delay campaign. I had to put the Wizard of Oz in there. It's like pulling the curtain. And I discovered, by the way, I talked to Gene about when I saw this picture, when you look at the picture very closely, you know, you remember who's pulling the curtain back of exposing the wizard? It's this tiny little dog. Whatever works, you know, if it's a dog, that's fine. Anyway, and also not just to expose them, to win the population over to a faster transition. So second reason behind this research is, well, I used to be a principal policy advisor. There's a long story here. I was an academic first, and then somebody said, we need your help down in Wellington, your thinking. I tell you, moving from academia to the policy environment, where you have to stand in front of a minister and say, I've done my homework, minister, and I think this will work. And it's like, if it doesn't, well, anyway. But I think I know a little bit about how things work in Wellington. So what I wanted to do, secondly, was to investigate whether there were additional, particularly supply-side measures that, in addition to the exploration ban, which the government has passed on offshore exploration, that ministers and particularly advisors who are supposed to be researching on options for climate change could consider that might help speed up the transition to a low-carbon economy. So let's look at some of the tools that, and I'm just going to share a couple of glimpses here, tools that I use for analyzing the industry's propaganda campaign. And by the way, this is the newest CEO for petroleum exploration, for PEPAN's Petroleum and Exploration, New Zealand, John Carnegie. So from a content analysis that I did of PEPAN's in-house reports, they have a consultant and whatever, and they get together and they have a team, they provide a report, and then they distribute this, very impressive looking report all over the place and use it for lobbying. Submissions that they make to select committee, conference presentations, media releases, social media messaging. They've gotten done that big in the last couple of years. PEPAN's lobbying and propaganda campaign appears to have at least 5 main aims. And again, here we're talking about, not strategic thought here, but these come through a kind of content analysis. The first is that the industry is pushing for a return to the policy environment that prevailed under the previous national government that actively supported expanding oil and gas development and production. It's trying to generate popular support for the industry and for defeating the ban, which, of course, is national policy. National policy is to reinstitute the ban. Or at least, if not defeating the government and getting rid of the ban, at least weakening their mandate so they can't do anything more harmful to the industry. Secondly, to increase public support for the industry itself and acceptance of the idea that continued dependency on oil and gas is a practical necessity. And you'll hear that coming through very strongly in a lot of the propaganda. That's fine. You've got some points. Things are getting tough. Climate change. But really, really, we've got to be practical. I mean, people are driving petrol cars. You know, we're turning on the gas stove. Let's be practical. Third, to avoid paying for climate impacts and incurring losses that could result from aggressive government climate mitigation initiatives, like paying, loading taxes onto and penalties on undeveloped assets and creating stranded assets, or full rig decommission costs. You probably know right now, the government, public taxpayer of New Zealand, foots about half the bill of decommissioning the offshore wells, except in the case of the Tamarind debacle, which some of you, Tamarind, okay, I won't go. A Malaysian company that's gone belly up after taking over an oil operation, Tui, I think it was, out in, and literally ran into real trouble and couldn't complete their operations and basically declared bankruptcy. And New Zealand's left holding the bill. The last bill I saw was $150 million it's going to cost the taxpayer to get rid of all those unused oil wells that Tamarind very generously has gifted us. Fourthly, to maintain as usual, business as usual, for as long as possible, to extract as much profit as possible from existing operations. That's pretty straightforward. And finally, this is the one I was talking about earlier, to obtain a seat at the policy table, which is that shift I talked about several years ago. And in fact, when this government, the one that's just passed, was helping Taranaki prepare with Venture Taranaki, was preparing the just transition model, Taranaki 2050. Pepans was there at the summit and was very active in lobbying for a role to be played going forward in transitioning Taranaki. At any rate, and not only in COVID-19 recovery influence, but also influencing the pace of transition to a low carbon economy. So those are some main aims. Just a side comment, Noam Chomsky, who I'm sure most of you know, he's a linguist, not quite an anthropologist, but a linguist. In his book, Manufacturing Consent, well worth a read if you haven't read it, observed, and he's really into propaganda, he suggested that a clue to effective propaganda is repetition, repetition, repetition. If you've read 1984, you'll recognize this. Mine content analysis of the industry's mainstream and social media stories, reports, online messaging has revealed at least 7 rhetorical claims, I'll call them, assertions that feature repeatedly, and some would say ad nauseum, in their lobbying and their PR campaign and their opinion pieces in the newspapers and so on. And the first one is that the oil and gas industry is not run by a bunch of big overseas corporations. The oil and gas industry is New Zealand's industry. developing New Zealand's publicly owned policies for the good of the country. It sounds kind of like a welfare agency. Secondly, the oil and gas industry generates major benefits to New Zealand. It sort of depends on at what stage you hear them say this and what data pool they're using to make their benefit claims. And they certainly don't talk about costs. They only talk about benefits to the country. If they total up the costs, it would be a different quantum. Thirdly, the oil and gas industry, this one I like because it's one of the main ones. The oil and gas industry is a safe, science-based, technologically innovative industry that follows strict regulatory guidelines and protects the environment during all its operations. Amen, brother. Sorry. Fourthly, natural gas reduces emissions. Anybody here right now pressing the button saying, wait a minute. Let's look at the science here. I won't go into the science of methane and how much is produced, and it's 40 times more than carbon dioxide in the short term and so on. But all you have to do is say, are we talking about all the gas produced, flared off, circulated and piped, and used in homes and so on? And if that's the amount of gas and methane we're talking about, then when you compare it with coal, according to a couple of university studies, it's pretty close. At any rate, so there's some real doubt around that from the climate scientists. Fifth, the exploration ban itself, when it was enacted in 2017, was deeply flawed. It was an undemocratic process. They were big on that during that stage, and should be overturned, which of course is National Party policy in the lead up to the next election. Sixth, transition to a low carbon economy, or I say low carbon economy, you read Pepin's literature and reports and you hardly ever see reference to a low carbon economy. They did at the beginning when it first came out, Productivity Commission's report and so on, low carbon economy. Now they're pushing low emissions economy. And it's pretty obvious why you wouldn't want to refer, if you were a fossil fuel company, to low carbon. That can be measured. At any rate, it's going to take time, is the point of this rhetorical message. It'll take time. We've got to be realistic. We'll have to rely on gas and oil, and it can only be achieved with government and the petroleum industry working in partnership. Forget about the rest of the community. And finally, and this one I really like, environmentalists, because I've been the butt of it myself several times, environmentalist activists, or climate activists, if you want to put yourself in that category, are mostly ill-informed or half-informed, let's be charitable, half-informed, irresponsible, or not quite responsible enough, ideologically driven extremists. Now that last mantra is clever, if you think about it, because when it's picked up, and I know from personal experience in the sports club I'm a member of, when it's picked up in the media, as well as being bandied around pubs and sports clubs and wherever real people get together, it becomes common sense wisdom, okay? It means anyone then who expresses a concern about climate change can be dismissed, if you want, as some kind of idiotic tree hugger. It's called beyond the pale, all right? And the industry actually does have a sense of where the pale is out there. If you're Irish, you'll know what I mean. Beyond the pale is what? Savages. At any rate, certainly uncontrollable types are beyond the pale. That's the real message. Unlike practical, down-to-earth Kiwis who supposedly have sensible doubts about all this. And remember, Pepin's claims to speak for ordinary, hardworking New Zealanders, while at the same time citing so-called evidence that contradicts climate science and so on. Now, when this mantra becomes accepted and bandied about, I mean, real men having a beer, what are you, climate change? What? Huh? Well, if you haven't heard that, I certainly have. Maybe I'm the only one who's drinking with people who, what are you? At any rate, When it becomes accepted, then the purveyors of climate denial and predatory delay have started to win the day. Some activist groups have chosen to confront and debunk the fossil fuel industry and think tanks that are dispensing this kind of propaganda. That's what the Fossil Fuels Aotearoa Research Network, of which I've been involved with, or FARN, has behind the scenes. Hopefully nobody's heard of us. Behind the scenes, it's a bunch of academics and climate justice Taranaki, and various other groups. And the basic point is it came about because climate activists and anti-oil people were saying, we're having a really hard time getting in touch with and allying with academics who know all this stuff, who do research. So that's where it came about. I'll give you an example. What is it? Extinction Rebellion has a team that's doing the same thing, okay? They say, right, anything we hear coming out, any media, we're there, bam, 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 science, evidence, answer. You know? Let me give you an example. It's just too priceless that I got to, this actually comes from the diaries themselves, internally. In October 2017, find the page. There it is. With the imminent, or I'm going to assume that you know some of this stuff I'm referring to here. I'll go kind of quickly, but raise a hand if you think, what's he talking about? With the imminent arrival of the Schlumberger, what am I talking about? One of the biggest oil services company in the world, Schlumberger, survey ship Amazon Warrior. Remember that? It was going to come and explore offshore in the Taranaki Basin, October 2017. Environmental groups began a new media campaign focusing on the impacts of seismic survey blasts on marine animals. Now, some of you may remember this episode. It popped up in the media briefly. On the 5th of October of 2017, Northland Greenpeace activist Mike Smith claimed on Watea News that seismic survey harmed marine life and should be banned. PEPAN's chairman, Cameron Medwick, who was prior to John Cameron, demanded the right of rebuttal and was interviewed by Watea a week later. You've probably heard of this strategy about equal opportunity to answer back. It's the climate denial thing. In the States, it's very big. At any rate, so he was given a chance and he was interviewed. Medwick maintained, and as we've agreed, I think, he's a very charming man. I've interviewed him, as you'll see. He demanded the right of rebuttal and maintained that, and here I quote, rigorous science and environmental compliance sat behind all seismic testing. The science indicated that, here I quote, sounds in the water of this acoustic imaging survey. You know what he's talking about? We're talking about blasts from seismic air pressure guns hanging off the back of the ships. I mean, these are cannons going off. Just aren't at the volumes and frequencies that various marine mammals will be impacted permanently by them. You want to back that up a couple of steps. Impacted permanently by them? That's a nice fudge, wasn't it? You see that one? Okay. If you're listening to him, you can put your hand up. Right? Wait, permanent? You mean sometimes, but it doesn't last so long? Like how many years? Anyway, he claimed the noise was no louder than a whale's click and was harmless. When the Maori interviewer on Watea asked about Maori opposition to this seismic survey and to exploration in general, Medwick responded with the kind of, I got to read this carefully. Medwick responded with the kind of ingratiating paternalism that he usually reserved for environmental activists. Now, I'm hoping I'm not overdoing this. Oh, absolutely. We'd support the rights of iwi and hapu and found now, to make their points very strongly. We're very respectful, and I underline that, of the views of Te Ao Māori, and are keen to ensure that we can have an open and transparent discussion with people, so that if they hear the full story, that perhaps some of those concerns that they hold will be managed. I like that, managed. 2 days later, Farn arranged to have Watea interview Dr. Liz Slutin, who's a professor of biology at the University of Otago, who rebutted Madgwick's claims about rigorous science standing behind seismic surveying. She's had quite a bit of experience, particularly studying sperm whales off Kaikoura, Taranaki, and in other parts of the world. Slutin noted that while whale clicks carry up to 20 or 30 kilometers, now we're getting into evidence-based science as opposed to propaganda. While whale clicks carry up to 20 or 30 kilometers under the ocean, the air guns used in seismic testing can be detected hundreds of kilometers away. She cited fellow marine scientist Chris Clark from Cornell University, who had recorded airgun blasts from thousands of kilometers away and estimated each seismic survey that was carried out caused 100,000 square kilometers to be, in his words, awash with noise, unquote. Slutin said sperm whale clicks were nothing like that. She concluded that there was no question seismic surveying had serious effects on marine mammals. In subsequent weeks, other international marine experts were interviewed by the media, and all of them had backed Slutin, and some of them actually done research in New Zealand. The whole episode must have been extremely irksome for Madgwick, if not downright embarrassing, because it, on the media, discredited Pepin's mantra that the petroleum industry's claims were always backed by solid science. That's directly from the diaries.
Available to back of the room.
Yeah, back there, if you want to get one. At any rate, okay, I got to move on very quickly. As you know, because I'm shifting from looking at the propaganda campaign and how you can pick it apart, to what are the impacts on government policy and what alternatives might we have. As you know, boy, do I have to catch up, don't I? There we go. As you know, based on scientific evidence of harm, the New Zealand government has taken steps to make New Zealand smoke-free by 2025. Evidence, harm, policy, stop it. So you would think that with growing evidence of the climate harm that fossil fuels are doing, that successive governments would be in a process of phasing them out as well. I don't think so. At least not as far as national is concerned. In response to the 2008 global financial crisis, John Key's government adopted, each government has this policy framework. The policy, you may know, the policy framework under Key's government was the business growth agenda. And one of the key components of that framework, policy framework, was to see oil and gas development and its GDP earnings shift from, at that time, about $3 billion. It's a bit overstated, but about 2.5 to $3 billion, 10 times as much. So by 2020, the industry was supposed to be earning about $30 billion, 30 billion in GDP, which obviously hasn't happened. In fact, they've gone the other way. At any rate, when the Labour-led coalition was elected in 2017, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern declared the country must, I know you're thinking nuclear-free, but also she declared the country must end its reliance on fossil fuels, actually said that, and transition to a zero-carbon economy by no later than 2050. Within a few months, as you know, the government had passed the ban had enacted the ban on future offshore oil and gas exploration, and much to the dismay of the industry, who's still continuing to attack it. But there, the bold action has basically stopped, apart from the passage of the Zero Carbon Act a couple of years later. I mean, there have been some tinkering with the ETS. There have been negotiations still going on and on and on with the farming sector. There was the failed attempt to introduce a fuel-efficient car import subsidy, which one of the minor parties shot down. But certainly no further supply-side measures, as opposed to demand-side measures, like the exploration ban, to phase out the industry and to send, more importantly, send an important message to consumers and businesses that pretty soon there's not going to be at least any affordable fossil fuels, if any at all. On the contrary, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Energy and Resources has seemed to lean over backwards to placate the industry. She has allowed continued onshore exploration through the annual block offer process. She's granted extensions to existing offshore permits. I think a lot of people don't know that. They just think those permits are out there and we're not going to touch I think it's 26 permits, I think I'm right, that are out there. We're not going to touch those, the current government has said. But the minister is continuing every time the work program in those permits comes up of the deadline, the minister is turning it over. And some of us argue it's under some very dicey criteria that aren't clearly spelled out in the Act. In fact, Section 35 of the Crown Minerals Act suggests there's only one condition upon which the minister is supposed to be extending these existing offshore permits. And that's if they strike something and they need a little more time to evaluate the strike. There's only one that I know of that recently, that's OMV, has recently said, we think we've got something. All the rest, and there have been about 6 of them in the last year, have been granted on other bases. Mostly, like New Zealand Oil and Gas, because they're having trouble finding a drilling partner. And New Zealand Oil and Gas has been having trouble finding a drilling partner for 4 years. And they've got 3 extensions. The minister continues to offer. Now, there's a target for you if you want to get active. At any rate, so she's continued to grant extensions. She's retained a lot of the support for the industry that was put in place by the national government. And interestingly, she's pushed through, basically, over the objections of several environmental and climate lobby groups, a new strategy for minerals and resources, a 10-year strategy. Most of you are aware that this happened? It was pushed through at the end of last year. And some of us lobbied that it was being pushed through before the minister had completed the public review of the Crown Minerals Act and amendment. In other words, getting the cart before the horse. She's claimed that we're going to put up a strategy for developing minerals for 10 years, and then we're going to think about reviewing the Crown Minerals Act, which might in fact include things like climate change, which Pepins is dead against, which means you've got to go back to the strategy and think, wait a minute, now why are we digging up oil and gas then? The minister said we're going to get pushed through. So she's pushed through the strategy. Anyway, she's basically trying to have a bob both ways. And she's also, unfortunately, bought into the petroleum industry's scientifically discredited, as you probably guessed, mantra about gas being a bridge fuel. And boy, has it been discredited. At any rate, the government has maintained that transition will take, think about this in context. The government has maintained that transition will take decades because moving any faster, this is Jacinta's own words, because it will be too disruptive socially and economically. She said that before COVID, okay? Talk about social and economic disruption. It's possible to have disruption and bold government action. Anyway, it's admittedly a politically expedient stance with the election underway, but our future emissions continue rising and we're still importing gas-guzzling twin-cab utes in record numbers. Okay, let me quickly then go on because I want to sort of wind this up. At COP25, Madrid, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called on governments to urgently end fossil fuel extraction and burning. As part of my research, I thought I'm going to look into supply-side research internationally, and there's quite a bit of it out there. And what that research demonstrated is that governments could reap significant benefits with a more balanced climate portfolio, not just all on demand side stuff, but also more on this. Now, the ban is a good example of a supply side initiative. It's like, stop it. Huh? There's not going to be any more. Or some Latin American countries socialize the industry, right? Just take it over and turn it off. Then so against that kind of background of research, I came up with what I think are reasonably sensitive supply-side initiatives. One of them is to cease granting ministerial extensions to offshore exploration permits. Another initiative on the supply side might be to halt onshore exploration. In other words, stop the annual auction of permits. Thirdly, cut remaining subsidies and tax breaks. The Minister and Treasury deny that we have subsidies. Studies have shown we do have subsidies. And we have a body in IMBI, Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment, called New Zealand Petroleum and Minerals, whose task is to continue promoting the oil and gas industry. It's a government function that we've got going on. So you could review that outfit. In terms of legislative reform that's in the pipeline, the government could include climate change mitigation in the new resource management legislation. They could include it in the EEZ Act, which would be kind of cool because then you wouldn't have these hearings where people made submissions and the chairperson said, sorry, we can't deal with climate change in your resource consent objection. Or in the purpose statement of the Crown Minerals Act. The government could revise the 10-year minerals and resource strategy to include phasing out fossil fuel extraction over that 10-year period. I mean, that's reasonable. It's pushy, but it's possible. And perhaps twinned with a program of rising taxes. And finally, it could, if it really got bold, take some of the COVID money and establish a fund for any companies who, like Tamarind, wish it had been there, that companies want to just bail out and say, we're leaving. The government could kick in a little bit and say, fine, farewell, here's your little nod. Just let me say one final thing and then I'll wrap up. Peppan's CEO, the guy I showed you earlier, John Carnegie, in a recent, heard my stuff about supply side suggestions. And in a recent Stuff opinion piece, he attacked my research. He's usually been pretty nice to me. He sent me a couple of emails, which I didn't answer. Anyway. And he dismissed such supply-side proposals, and I'm going to quote, as laughable and totally uneconomic. Of course. Of course. And it makes sense if you just don't take the climate crisis into account, which Peppan seldom does in its propaganda. And then such radical measures might become thinkable. A bit like closing our borders with COVID. I mean, that's pretty radical. It was a rare slip, I think, in Carnegie's sort of slick, we were talking about the slick, PR campaign. Again, back to Wizard of Oz. It just, just slightly, all right. But it's pretty clear to me that the industry is not only becoming worried, we knew that, but they're also beginning to become aggressive. Well, I'm going to stop, but briefly, those are some of the findings from my latest research about the New Zealand petroleum industry's propaganda campaign. and I document that in my latest book back there. And let me just sort of summarize where we've been. Because we're all aware, climate scientists every day issue seemingly more and more dire warnings about how rapidly the climate crisis is worsening. We just look on television and see California, and that gets driven home to us. We've left it late. We know we've left it late, and it's all of us. I think probably a lot of analysts, ministers are beginning to realize we've left it late. But still the government, like ours, is not acting, they're not acting quickly enough, and the clock is ticking. And the more you start hearing these reports coming out, the more urgent is the message. Which is why I think Sir Jonathan Porritt, Britain's sustainability guru, has recently, in his recent book, suggested that it's probably time that people have now little choice. And this is a Lord of House of Commons, House of Lords, have little choice but civil disobedience to confront the political and corporate power structures. I'll end with this one though, because just the last couple of weeks, the late civil rights activists, the black congressman, John Lewis, who's just recently passed, just reasonably months before he passed on, he called on people who were concerned about social and environmental injustice to get into good trouble. I kind of like that. No reira tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you. I'll take questions, yeah, or comments, or just don't throw things. Yeah.
Have you thought about, or can you comment on something I haven't thought about? That one time in technology, a long time ago, steam based on wood was